Good morning. Is that working? Good morning. Good morning, yes. Thank you for all waking up and getting here on a Saturday morning. This is the graveyard slot, and you deserve an extra prize for being here. We've got three really interesting people here. On my right, James Ball, a former colleague from The Guardian, who's now, he tells me, global editor of the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. Lea Korsgaard, who I met in Copenhagen 6 months ago, and is the publisher of Zetland, having been the editor-in-chief, and Hanna Israel, who is the editor of a really fascinating bit of Zeit, which is all about, focused on people. And what I wanted to talk about today is where the audience fits into journalism. And it's sort of loosely pegged on this book, which I wrote at the worst possible time, in the sense that it was published to journalists. It seemed to me there was a gulf in understanding that had sprung up between the two. I saw an awful lot of hostility to journalism that was perhaps not merited. Some of it was. And I saw a lot of journalists who were disenchanted with the people who were actually paying their bills. And I thought there were sort of really three waves in this. The first was the excitement that some of us felt, not all of us, some of us felt, at the suddenly being able to see and meet and talk to your readers. Of course, you could always ring them up and they could write a letter, but that wasn't real interaction. And then suddenly you had the enormous possibilities of those interactions. And all these phrases began to spring up from academics. And I wish Dan Gilmore was here today, because I think it was Dan coined this phrase, our readers know more than we do. Which came as a bit of a shock to some journalists, but was obviously true in most circumstances. And then people started writing the people, talking about the people formerly known as the audience. And it seemed full of possibility. But two things happened. One was there was a power exchange there in which journalists then lost agency to these other people who could answer back. And the second was that they did answer back, and when they answered back, they weren't always very pleasant. And journalists took an affront at that. And they thought, okay, that was a nice attempt, but these people are horrible, and we'll stop now. So that led to the second wave, which was the sort of backlash, where newspapers, I noticed, started turning off the comments and saying, actually, we don't want to hear from these people. We're not going to engage with them. We hate social media. Have you seen what these people say out there? I can't see what's to be gained from trying to, that was a nice dream, but it failed. And then along came the third wave, sitting at the table here tonight, this morning, who said, no, not so fast. Actually, there are still great possibilities here, and really started building news organizations around the audience, the readers. And I think some of the best investigative reporters realized that there were new ways of doing journalism that reimagined this relationship. So there were those three waves, and we might talk about each of them at some point. But just to give you, and I'm honestly going to shut up in a second, I wrote this book in an alphabetical form, just taking some of the things that I thought might be confusing. So what do we mean by bias? B for bias. What do we mean by impartiality? Impartiality is a word that is used a lot, but do we understand what it means? Do we understand what accuracy means? What role do metrics, M for metrics, play in our judgments as journalists? I did an M for Murdoch, and I also did a P for proprietors, because I think if you're a reader trying to work out the extent to which what's in your newspaper is influenced by Rupert Murdoch or whoever owns the title, and even that's a difficult question to answer, because if you work for the Wall Street Journal, that's probably very different from working for Fox News or The Sun. One, it might be less relevant, or it might be more relevant for the comment pages, but for the news pages. So we're asking a lot from readers to understand where they should put their trust. I did some entries on individual journalists, Robert Fisk, a much celebrated and lauded journalist, except by almost all journalists who worked with him on individual stories. And I looked at one or two stories that Robert Fisk had written and spent sort of 2 or 3 days looking at them, and I thought, honestly, I don't know. I've worked in this business for 40 years. I don't know whether I believe that story or not. And yet we somehow expect our readers to place their trust on individual brands or individual journalists or on the whole profession of journalism. And just on that last thing, who gets to be a journalist these days? And what is the craft that we believe is the most reliable way of getting at the truth? And I think there's a huge difference of opinion about that. I was speaking to a panel yesterday, and what it is to be a journalist on The Sun is very different from being a journalist on the BBC. A journalist on the Fox News will be entirely different from a journalist on the New York Times, and yet we call it the same. We just say this is journalism, and we expect our readers to understand what is meant by that word. So that was what that book was trying to do. That's what we're going to try and get into in this session. And I thought I would just begin by asking whether the panelists, we haven't pre-convened at all, so I genuinely don't know what they think. But Hanna, let's start with you. Do you agree that there is a great deal of misunderstanding between the producers and the consumers? And if so, what do you think they find hard to understand?
I definitely think that there is a great misunderstanding. You just said we're asking for a lot, but I think we also underestimate what our readers or the audience knows already, or what they're seeking for. And there's this example of actually our new Minister of Economic Affairs, who I think has done a great job in communicating. Robert Habeck, he's from the Green Party. He was on this talk show the other day, and he was invited because of the criticism against him that now we're going to buy gas from Qatar instead of Putin, because, well, we can't anymore. And so he was getting a lot of criticism, and he was basically accepting that criticism and then stating in the interview with this journalist, you know what, yes, we're now going to buy gas from the next devil, and it is not good, and it is morally really, 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 really bad, but we have to do it. It's the lesser evil. It is not as bad as buying oil from Putin. That's what we can't do anymore. So it's a little bit better to turn towards Qatar now. And you know, other economic ministers would have said, you know what, Qatar has done a lot of change within the last years. They're really turning towards human rights now, and they're doing a lot, and we're going to encourage them to turn towards Western values, which is bullshit. And everyone knows that, and the readers and the audience knows that. So I think he has actually given a great example of being a good journalist, because instead of just writing down or telling the people what a politician wants to do and whether there's enough money to actually do that and what are the counter-arguments, do you really have to tell the people why they're doing that? You have to give them the motives. You have to tell them what lobby group kind of influenced them in order to do such politics, because that is what they are reading in other outlets. That is what they are reading in social media, you know, and that's why they're turning towards these apparent, conspiracy theories, these lies, because they want to know the motives. So I think we have to explain more in order to, again, kind of gain their attention and not have them turn towards conspiracy theories.
Great answer. Lea, how about you? How would you answer that?
I agree. I think there is a huge gulf between what journalists think, why their purpose, why they're here. And I'm speaking in these general terms, which actually doesn't really make any sense, like you said, Alan. But forgive me for that. But there is this gulf between what journalism perceive the goal of journalism to be, and on the other side, the public, the people who are supposed to, do something with the journalism. And sometimes I think that the news genre and the kind of style and tone of voice that comes with the news genre is in and of itself, in a sense, broken, because it doesn't apply for, or it doesn't make it necessary. I'm looking for a word here. Sorry, it's early. It doesn't allow us for the journalists to actually fulfill the need that they are here for, namely explaining the world and putting the puzzle together, put the story in the right context, as you say. There's something about the news genre that doesn't allow for that. So it's actually, I think, if we are to sort of bridge this gap, we are to reconsider these old categories. What is news? What is the right tone of voice to explain important stuff in? What role? What kind of a need do we actually fulfill? So it's those very basic questions that are so important to grapple with in order to bridge that gap, I think.
James.
I sort of think we've kind of gone down two very diverging paths with audience, and I think one set of journalism is getting further and further away from it than it has been for decades, because it turns out it's quite uncomfortable being nearer the audience. I can remember, I will keep him nameless, a very, very good Guardian journalist whose sort of investigative and quite worthy pieces would often only get about 5,000-10,000 views online. And he wasn't remotely concerned with how he could change them to get more. I sort of asked why, and he said, well, we sell 150,000 copies of the paper every day, and that means 150,000 people read it in that. And he genuinely believed that, because of course we all read the down pager on page 8 just as thoroughly as we read the splash, don't we? And he couldn't be moved from that view, because as long as the audience was abstracted for him, he could imagine people were faithfully reading every word. And sort of similarly, you'd have very unrealistic expectations from the audience side. I used to run the Guardian's data team, and any time any statistic was even loosely used in the Guardian, Ben Goldacre, who's a sort of academic epidemiologist, does incredibly good research work, and is a very good science communicator, but also a massive pain in the butt. He would write to me or email me or phone me furious as if I was the lord of all numbers in the Guardian and could sort of regulate what people had said that I'd never met. We did actually have a reader's editor. He just preferred a direct line to another nerd. And so, you had an audience expectation that every number would hit an academic standard. And so you have mismatches, you have misunderstandings. And where I work now, it's quite interesting in that we have very specialist investigative teams on global health, on finance and corruption, on the environment. And sometimes people will be quite candid with each other and say, I don't really understand this story, from another team. And it's a bit like a sort of soap opera that you haven't watched for 15 years. And, if I go home at Christmas, my mom will sort of be able to fill me in on about 10 years in the gap between two sentences on the show. We sort of do the news story as if you have to have watched every episode for the last 15 years. We don't start people in ways that bring them in very well. We don't explain as we would to someone in a cafe or in a bar. And I think as we go on that sort of, all of this is really hard, the conversations are difficult, we end up moving to a place where we try and imagine the audience aren't there again, because they're a lot nicer when they're in the abstract. And I worry even really amazing outlets like the New York Times are starting to do that with the disengage from Twitter idea. I separate out the abuse and harassment side of this because they're not the audience. The audience are often quite critical and often have difficult feedback on, did we frame this story right? Did we do the headline? Were we too credulous? They're invested, they care, and so they want to change it. And so that disengagement I find worrying. On the flip side, we, as investigations sort of journalists, often find now we can only get stories if we work with the people formerly known as the audience. Some of my colleagues on Bureau Local worked with Deliveroo drivers to get a database of thousands and thousands of pay slips to find that in the UK they were often getting under the minimum wage. And the way they got 300 Deliveroo drivers to give several months of this was that firstly we worked with and through a union, and then we trained up several Deliveroo drivers with basic journalistic skills to help recruit other Deliveroo drivers. And part of this as well is working out, is this participatory or is this extractive? You know, are we trying to get something that gives us a great story and doesn't deliver something for the people who do it, or do they get something out of it? And if it's extractive now, especially in not-for-profit world where I live, you can't really do it because you can't then go to the next community and say, hey, I got an award. You know, nothing changed for them or nothing was useful for them, but it was great for me. If you could actually show that these are there, it's great. So on the reporting side, you know, we've done things like, you know, recruit people, training as priests to have good access in communities. We've worked with sort of language radio, we've worked with trade unions. If we work in other countries, we try and work with someone not just in that country, but from that country and in it. You know, we try not to be the fly-in remote ones. And it's so much harder than I ever thought audience would be 10 years ago when I sort of worked with Alan. We did a lot of the early, you know, open journalism, citizen journalism stuff. But I really do think there's value to it. And I think it's sad that as we're now a decade in and starting to learn what works, some people are taking a more comfortable route and stepping back.
I completely recognize what you're saying there, James. Because social media can be so toxic and people don't hold back, it's very easy to get a full sense of your readers. On The Guardian, at one point, we had a building that enabled us to invite lots of readers in over one weekend. And the journalists were quite shocked to meet them. They thought, but these are really nice people. And their image had been constructed by everything they'd read below the line or had seen on Twitter. And they had got to the point where they just didn't want to have anything to do with the readers. They met them in the flesh. They loved them. And not all news organizations are lucky enough to have the facility to be able to host those kinds of things. But Lea, I want to turn to you because your organization, Zetland, is relatively young. And my sense from when we met before is that you began by building it around the audience. Can you just explain how you've done that?
Yeah, so I totally recognize the feeling of being at a legacy media, being quite distant from the audience. I used to work as a feature writer at Politiken, one of the big legacy media in Denmark, and I cannot remember one meeting where we talked about the readers, which we must hopefully have done it. I really hope, but just the fact that I don't remember is really tells me something about where we came from. So when I co-founded Zetland, we decided to call our subscribers members, because we knew that we could get and wanted more out of them than just money and just attention. Because, of course, they represent a bunch of knowledge and perspectives and ideas, and also just, you know, they are the ones who are to tell us what we are going to do. Not literally, but we have to really listen to them in order to craft the product. So what we do is that, like, really just listen. In every opportunity we have, more or less every day, we ask them for advice, for their perspective, for their knowledge, in what we just call notes on the front page, you know, asking, so I'm the new editor for politics, come with me, meet with me and tell me how I should go about covering politics in a way that you would like. just as an example. When our members become member, we ask them, why are you here? Just that simple question, and letting them, in their own voice and with their own words explain why they're here is so interesting. What do they want to get out of this encounter with us? We have open board meetings, so when Tao, he's the CEO of Zetland, he's right down here, when we have had a board meeting, we kind of replicate that with our members to let them, invite them in and give them a chance to understand the business, because we need their perspectives to develop the product. So for instance, it must have been 4 years ago, they told us in emails, in meetings, in meetups, we like what you do. It was text-based only at that point, Zetland. We like what you do, but you do kind of, it's long form. And I'm a busy person. I'm a nurse, I'm a teacher. I don't have the time to, lie on my couch and read a 20-minute long article. So maybe if you read it aloud in an audio version, I would use your content more. So we did that. We started to do audio versions of every text article that we did, and now 80% of the product is listened to, not read, which just tells me something that also on the business side, you really, there's so much gold and important information out there that you have to, on every occasion, draw out of them. When we had a housewarming, we moved to another address. We had a housewarming last week. Of course, the housewarming should not only be for us, the team, the 40 people that works at Zetland, but for the members. So we invited 300 people we invited them to come, and 300 came, and just that meeting, listening to who are you, why are you here, what do you think of journalism, what is your point of view in the world, it gives so much information about how we should craft the product.
All that's fascinating, Lea. I mean, how granular is your knowledge of readers, and what do they volunteer? So, for instance, I'm writing about COVID. Have I got a database of people who are doctors or epidemiologists or scientists who I can turn to, who've said, I'm willing to help, and do you give them articles to read for mistakes? I mean, are they participating in the editorial processes?
Yeah, so we asked them to fill out a form. What do you know something about? And that could be, I'm a doctor, or I know lots about knitting, and that's just a huge database that we can go search in. If we are doing a story on COVID and some part of Denmark, go search who do we know in this part of Denmark that knows stuff about COVID, or is a doctor or a nurse. So that's really helpful. And then also sometimes we invite readers or members to become editors, just a small group. We are working on this article. It's kind of complex, and we want to get it right. So would you mind read it before we publish it and tell us if there's something that you don't understand or something that we should expand on or go deeper into? And then 10, 15 members raise their hands and say, yeah, we would like to participate. So they read the article before, and that is really helpful. But also, a loss of control, in a sense, which I think is key here. You have to, don't be afraid. Just show everything, because by showing what you're working on, which stories is cooking, what are you in doubt of, that's not, in a sense, I think that kind of vulnerability is a strength, because it makes the connection, it makes for the trust and the relationship that we want to build with them.
My favorite example on The Guardian of completely inverting the journalistic model was meeting the Dutch journalist Joris Luijendijk. and I didn't know anything about Joris other than he had been a Middle Eastern reporter and he was quite a sort of big TV star in the Netherlands. When he came back from the Middle East, I think he was at a slightly loose end, and his editor said, "What do you want to do now?" He said, "Well, I think the really important thing for climate change is the electric car, so I'd like to write a column about the electric car." His editor said, "Okay, you've got a year, you can write a weekly column about the electric car." Joris's first column began explaining why he thought this was an important column to write. And the last paragraph said, "By the way, I know nothing about this subject." So that's the opposite of what a journalist is supposed to do. A journalist should at least go to Wikipedia and find 3 facts about the electric cost. That's why you read me. I'm the person who's going to, I have the expertise. And the readers sort of picked their jaws up and said, "What, you're writing a column and you know nothing?" And Joris said, "Yeah, what should I know?" And they said, "Well, let's start with the battery." "Okay, I'll start with the battery. What should I know about the battery?" And suddenly he had this group of people who wrote the column with him and said, "Well, you really got to understand this about the battery in order to even begin this conversation." And over the course of a year, he pulled in this pool of expertise who guided his column. And people thought, well, this guy isn't bullshitting us because he's admitted he's a bullshitter. I mean, he's admitted he could have been a bullshitter, but what he's doing is totally transparent. We can see how he's writing it and where he's getting his facts from. And I thought that was so interesting. And I said to Joris, "Is there anything else you know nothing about? Because if so, you can have a Guardian column." And it was just after the financial crash. And he said, "Well, I know nothing about the finance industry." I said, "Okay, you're hired." He comes along, he writes his first column. This is why I'm so interested in the finance industry. By the way, I know nothing about it. And all these bankers and investment traders and investment bankers and hedge fund managers then started flooding him. And no one had ever, I mean, they'd had 10 tons of shit poured all over them for the last 5 years. It was the first time anybody had said, "Actually, tell me what you do and tell me how you feel about it." And he wrote a series of amazing columns that no other journalist had ever been able to do because he was approaching it in a completely different way. And it went on to become a best-selling book. It was just an example of inverting the model of journalism to say, well, I know you would think I'm the expert, but actually you're the experts, and why don't we start with you?
Can I add something to that? Anyway, by the way, it was a fantastic book and a fantastic column. But I think it has to do with authority. That once in the 20th century, we as journalists built authority by pretending or thinking that we knew everything, and put a tie on and sounded very authoritarian in a sense. This is the truth that I'm now telling to you, the audience. And I just don't think that's the way to build authority today. It's quite the contrary. It's get rid of that necktie and stand not above your audience, speaking down to them with the truth, but just laying it out there. I don't know, you know. Let's get into this business together.
Hanna, tell us about the work you're doing on Zeit.
Yeah. So. What we have been building is a platform for political dialogue. Back in 2017, when, Trump got elected as president of the United States, you guys voted for the Brexit, not yourself, but your country. And there was a rise in right-wing populism in Germany as well. We realized that there's a real disconnection from a big part of society. And we kind of wanted to counteract that disconnection or give a platform for people to be able to reconnect to people that think totally different from each other. So actually, in the first year, 2017, we asked a few controversial political questions that could either be answered with yes or no, put them on our website, and then asked our readers whether they wanted to discuss those questions with someone that had answered all of them differently. And we expected about 500 people to sign up. In the end, it was 12,000 people that wanted to have this discussion, made us think that it might be a good idea to professionalize this, build a whole algorithm about it, a software that can do that automatically. And so since 2017, we're running different programs in Germany together with other media partners, actually from other politically leaning newspapers, because only then it makes sense. I mean, you can't put only your readers, which are already in a bubble, into a conversation, but with readers from other outlets. So we're doing that, for instance, with the FAZ, Frankfurter Allgemeine, who's rather center-right leaning. But we've also expanded that to Europe. So we're having Europe Talks every year, which is a cross-border cooperation with media outlets from all over Europe. So we're putting people into a cross-border debate about topics that are controversial in Europe. We did have other formats in the US, actually, in Britain, actually with the Daily Mirror, which is super interesting because obviously this is maybe rather a tabloid, but the people who are signing up there are very interesting because they're different to us. And that is actually very crucial if we put like their readers into a conversation with our readers, you know, it really opens up new perspectives. But we're not only putting those people into a conversation, we are also covering some of those conversations. I mean, most of them are happening in private, they're not being watched at, it's thousands of conversations, but we do tend to contact some of those people when we think the pair is very interesting, very diverse in terms of backgrounds, but also political opinions, and then we ask them to listen to the conversation. We send reporters, photographers, and then we cover that in our news site. And I think that is very crucial because we're giving those people a voice, we're making them heard. They're normal people, but they feel empowered because we're asking them for their opinion and we're portraying that in an outlet where they're normally not portrayed in. So I think this is really crucial when it comes to re-establishing trust with the audience. You really need to engage them. You need to ask them what they think, and you need to make sure they're being in a news site, because it's not only an effect on themselves, but also on people who are similar to those, because finally, again, they see, oh wow, this is a person that's like me, and that is in this national media outlet, you know. And so you feel this connection and you feel that you're being empowered. There's actually another project we have been starting last year, which is called D49, D49. And we have asked readers whether they want to be part of a citizen council that is representative of Germany. So again, we thought that a few hundred people might want to join this project. In the end, it was 30,000 people asking to be part of the Citizen Council. So we had our data scientists, our data journalists setting up, out of these 30,000 people, a council of 49 people. And they were part of the editorial team for a whole year. There were weekly meetings where they could criticize what we have been doing, where they could bring in their own ideas, and also kind of, help us reflect on our own work. So that is our approach towards really engaging people, not just having them comment, an article that we have been publishing, but really asking for their opinion.
How has this changed, if it has, the main newsroom at Die Zeit? Do they welcome this feedback, or do they feel a bit suspicious of it?
I guess both is true at the same time. My colleague, who's kind of the head of this project, really says that never has he learned that much about his own job and about life when talking to these people. It has really been mind-blowing, and so many stereotypes that he had on people were kind of reversed. And I think, you know, it's really, I mean, I think we all touched upon that now. we really have to admit and realize, and I think that's sad, but we do need to realize it, that we're so disconnected from big parts of society, and we think that we're so much better and cleverer, but we're not. And, I think every time you're kind of working with those people, setting up these different councils, you realize that they're so clever, they have so many great ideas, that they have so important perspectives that really need to be included in our reporting. I mean, this whole debate about how can we connect again to society is also really about how do we actually need to change our own newsrooms. I mean, in terms of diversity, not only in terms of how many non-white people do we have on our board, but also how many people from non-academic backgrounds or from working class families are actually working in our newsroom. It is so crucial because it is different. What we tend to do is we take, the problem of unemployment, and then we write about it, not for the community that is affected by unemployment, but for ourselves. Why is the Sun, why is the Bild Zeit, and why are all these outlets so successful? Because they're writing for those communities in an awful way, of course. We shouldn't be copying that, but we need to change the perspective towards also thinking about, what person that might potentially read this article is actually personally affected by the situation? How can I help that person? This whole debate about should we become activists for, climate change, for, freedom whatsoever. I think we should become activists as journalists for the public good, and that means really including the perspective of the person I'm writing for. One example, we're actually now having at the Zeit this young editor, which is a great talent, Anna Maya, and she actually comes from a family that has been unemployed their whole lives. Like, neither father nor mother has been working. And she's writing just such great pieces, which are really mind-blowing. And she's publishing so much, I don't know how she actually manages to every week again, like 3-4 articles, touching upon unemployment, touching upon the shame that is being put on those people, and it is so interesting, and it gets read so well by our audience because it changes the perspective.
James, can you touched on your Deliveroo story, but what other examples can you give us of stories, investigations, as it were, that have come from the bottom up rather than the top down?
I think it's always a little bit of a combination of both, if we're honest, especially because for something like the Bureau, we don't particularly have an audience to think of. We have multiple different audiences to think about because everything we do collaborating or in partnership with one or often multiple media outlets and sometimes other non-media organizations. And so we don't necessarily have our own core audience that we can just go, hey, what should we do next? And if they were, they wouldn't be at all like the people who our work is about. And so what often happens is we will start ourselves a little way down the path from a quite traditional journalistic tip-off. We might start having heard something about, hospitals in certain African countries are paying a lot more for oxygen than you would pay anywhere else in the world. This was sort of early in the coronavirus crisis. And so we'd sort of start pursuing that in maybe a fairly traditional way. But what we would do sort of fairly early on is actually, rather than necessarily go really adversarially to places in the country or to hospitals in the country, actually then have a chat to them. And in this instance, it turned out pricing was an issue, but the sort of core of the story actually ended up, a lot of it was about something we just didn't know about, which was that places were being discouraged and there was lobbying on regulations and very misleading safety information being given about cheaper ways to get oxygen, sort of like, having a plant on site to extract it or using a slightly lower percentage purity of oxygen that, experts were telling us was just as safe, made no difference, and could be supplied more reliably. And we sort of did a first sort of slightly hesitant sort of story, and then got information actually from hospitals in Central and South America. saying that similar things were happening there, and we had better proof and better evidence. And so we got this ability to sort of talk about what was happening in much clearer terms. And what was useful for that was, because we had sort of put in quite early in the process this almost, you know, sit down and talk and go, are we chasing the right thing here? A coalition of NGOs, sort of the Every Breath Counts coalition, sort of found this much more useful to use for their efforts. And they then managed to secure, firstly, I think from the top of my head, please, Chrissy, give me a wave if this is radically wrong, $90 million of sort of extra funding to help sort of crisis access to it, but also various terms of agreements from some of the companies involved on how they would act in future, which things like that need monitoring. Nothing ever is fixed overnight. But the NGOs who knew far more than we did thought that these were concrete steps that might actually improve the situation. And so, you know, we do something like that quite early in investigations. It's sort of termed systems mapping. You know, who's involved, who's got power in this, who's got a stake in this, who's affected by it, and trying to sort of work out who all of those groups are and speak to them, which you can just say, that's good reporting, but it's sort of made a bit more systematic, and it's made sure that it's less sort of parachute in. And because we have that focus on impact, you know, will this journalism be useful? Will it help generate change? We don't then sort of lobby ourselves on it, but we want to make sure we have provided the tools that people who can do that will do. We end up thinking about who we partner with and audiences quite differently. And it can be quite strange in comfort zone terms. You know, as an example, The Guardian is an incredibly natural and wonderful partner for us. You know, it's got a huge reach. We like what they do visually. We like their journalists. I know lots of their journalists. We often have to think, are they actually the best partner for this particular story, though? Because Guardian readers are a lot like us. You know, they tend to, on the issues that we might push, already be aware of them and already know them. And then, you know, they're still a very good audience. They're still often very worth reaching. But actually, could we get this in the Daily Mail? Could we get this in the Financial Times? Could we get this in the Mail and Guardian in South Africa? You know, could we get it on The Continent, which is the sort of Pan-African WhatsApp publication? Could we get it in loads of them? You know, tabloids are often great because, especially if you're doing something about, you know, people on universal credit or people who are working on lower sort of income jobs for UK stories, if they're buying a paper, it's much more likely to be a tabloid. And so thinking about, hey, actually, how can we find angles? How can we find things that will get this issue in front of a new audience? That's sort of much more interesting and compelling. And thinking of the audience in that way only comes if you are impact focused. It sort of wouldn't come as a way of thinking about the audience from a commercial model. And so as we end up with different journalistic models, you know, ad subscription, membership, not-for-profit, and obviously there's lots of overlap, we're going to start thinking about and interacting with audiences in a very different way.
This would be a funny subject to be talking about if we didn't have any audience participation. So if anybody wants to shove their hand up now, or I'll come back to you in a couple of minutes if anybody's bursting to say something, because otherwise we would be very hypocritical just talking at you. Okay, well, we'll come back in a couple of minutes. I mean, two thoughts grow out of what James was saying. One is, and I think what you're both saying, there's a sort of certain humility required in journalists adjusting their mindset. I remember once we did a lot of work on tax avoidance, corporate tax avoidance, and we once made a big mistake on that, which cost us a lot of money. And after that, I thought, I'm going to be incredibly careful now in future to get everything signed off by people who understood it. But it turned out that almost nobody understood this subject. It's such a specialist subject, what corporates are up to, that really the only people who understand it are the accountants who advise the corporates, and sometimes even the corporates' directors didn't understand the complexity of the tax arrangements they had. And at one point we were sent some really interesting documents that we could not make any sense of at all. And so rather than go and try and find one of these handful of corporate lawyers who understood it, we just put it on the website and said, look, we've got this, we don't understand it. Who can help us here? And of course, we found people who could help us, and by the way, that saved us a lot of money in hiring the expertise. But there is that sort of humility thing, which I think is required. Lea, I mean, you have comments under your articles, people can respond. What is the quality of those, and how have you, if they're not toxic, I'm assuming they're not, how have you managed to change the nature of the debate?
Yeah, they are not toxic. I think we have, in the last 6 years, maybe had to delete 2 or 3 comments. So we call it the contribution section, not the comment section. So that in itself sort of signals this is just not random, comments, but it's come if you want to, share what you know, or share your perspectives. So that in itself, I think, is important. Then it's part of the journalist's job to actually kind of be a host in the section, be present, answer questions. Sometimes I think it's not weird that social media has sort of become, at least somewhere, these places where people just shout at each other because there's no host. There's no one, setting the agendas and kind of showing how this is supposed to be. So just that, there's something there. It's not an empty room you enter. And also, we often invite the sources in the articles to participate and answer questions, and that also, there's more people. There's someone there to engage with, and it has. I really sometimes the quality of that segment is better than the article, which is fine, and we can also see that the community is so strong, so that if people engage in a way that's not cool in this kind of environment, they will say that to each other in a very polite way. This is not how we do it at Zetland, so that's the Facebook style.
And when you look at legacy media, for want of a better word, I mean, a lot of journalists are still stuck in, actually, I don't want to have this conversation. Is that a fair thing to say? I
think it's a fair thing to say, but also maybe they don't want to have it because they don't have time. You have to allocate resources for that. It takes a lot of time, it takes energy, it takes hours to be there. So of course it has to be, your boss, your editor, has to promote, that kind of behavior for the journalist. It's part of your job. You spend time there. So I also sometimes think it has, it's not something you do in your spare time. It's part of the job.
And so in your allocation of time, you positively say to the journalists, please go back in and talk to the readers.
Yeah.
That's part of your job.
Yeah, and we have Lulu. She's a student worker at our, and she monitors the comment section, or the contribution section, and she will go, to the journalist, you're not there, you're supposed to be there in the section. Yeah, so it's really part of their job.
Yeah. I'm looking to the audience because you mustn't be a passive audience. You've got to be, you've got to play your part here. You're not stepping up. I know it's early in the morning on Saturday, but yes, please. You may have to speak up to be.
lot we don't know about readers. I think with incredibly resource intensive. And, how do you scale that? Like, how do you make it relevant enough to actually have an impact on your audience or frankly on your business if you've got a business model?
That's a good question. Now we have 28,000 members, but or we have 28,000 paying members, but more than 40,000 members who perceive themselves as members, because you can share your seat with two others if you pay for us. And of course, that's a question that we are now struggling with. That it takes time and energy. So, for instance, on social media, up until now, being present in that comment section hasn't been something that we've done, used super many resources on, but now we have to do that because we are growing. So, but I simply think like we spend money on photography and layout and coffee, then we also have to spend money on being present in the comment section, simply.
How big is your team, Hanna?
So it's actually quite small. It's 3 that are dealing with the My Country Talks platform, and then the other project I mentioned was again being covered by different people. But for full disclosure, we actually have built our own kind of GmbH, so charity that is part of Zeit Online, but a daughter company, and we're receiving funding for what we're doing at My Country Talks. Okay. So it is indeed a different kind of 2-pillar foundation, or let's say financing models. But I guess that's a whole other discussion whether that needs to be changed overall, and there needs to be more public spending on such things.
I'd love to know if there are any skeptics here who are listening to this thinking, well, this is all very lovey-dovey, but it doesn't work in real life. I can't imagine this working in the place that I work, or we tried that and it didn't work. Why? Or are you all completely convinced by everything you've heard so far?
Otherwise, I can be the skeptic.
Go on, be a skeptic.
Sometimes when I talk about this in Denmark, especially in Copenhagen, other journalists working in the media space in Copenhagen will sometimes, say to me, okay, but this only works because every member at Zetland are alike. You touched upon this, Hanna. They assume, well-educated, Copenhagen-based, a younger crowd. Probably also they think they're left-leaning. And for me, that just tells you something for well-educated people, which is so, that's just wrong. Also a nurse, also someone working with their hands, think the world is interesting. But you only find out if you actually reach out to them. And I think what you touched upon, Hanna, is so important, that when you do that, meet the kind of people that actually use your journalism, you just find out, whoa, that's not just the in-crowd, in our case, from Copenhagen, and of course not. Of course not. It's just the thought that, this, if you want to engage with other people, then you must be an academic. That's just wrong.
James, how much is this a generational thing? You've lived long enough. You're still quite young, but you've lived long enough to see these sort of waves of thinking, and you've been in newsrooms where a lot of reporters have said, look, I find this so toxic, I don't want to take part. The theory is lovely, but actually it's too, I don't get much from it, and it's too painful, and I don't have time. So, but do you think there's a new generation of young reporters coming in for whom this is utterly natural, and that they don't need persuading?
I don't think it's nearly as generational as people sort of assume by default, actually. I think there's a lot of people around my age, I'll take still quite young, that's a compliment. A lot of people around my age and a little bit younger especially women and people of colour who came in to newsrooms as they were sort of naively trying these first interact, be on Twitter, be in the comment threads, and we didn't really have anything in place as toolkits to help people for the harassment and the abuse and the, stalking that resulted. And I'm not sure those are solved problems by any stretch of the imagination, but I think there's quite a lot of people sort of 5 or 10 years into their careers who have been quite horribly burned by sort of badly done early audience interaction, or, and maybe, I don't think people were necessarily utterly to blame. We didn't know what was going to happen when we sort of opened the floodgates. But you've got a skepticism among some people in those groups, but not everyone. Some people, I'm obviously a white man, but I've had an extraordinary amount of online abuse, and I'm one of those people who, after a certain threshold, it's just now water off a duck's back. I could not care less. But other people go in a very different direction. So you have older people in the newsroom who are absolutely, totally on board with this, want to do this, believe in it, and have seen that if you do it well and you approach it in the right ways, it can really deliver, and it can deliver on old metrics. It doesn't have to be new, huggy digital journalism that, will get a Web Award and no one else will look at it. It can get you better, richer stories. It can get better real-world change. But you can also get very young journalists, especially from quite traditional backgrounds. If people come through the academic route, do a master's, they're often really sort of young fogey-ish as they come into a newsroom. I was talking to a journalism academic about this just yesterday. In fact, 2 different journalism academics on this yesterday. They sort of come in and they want to be a 1960s newspaper reporter. And, it's not that the schools are necessarily teaching that. The old men and the older women in the sort of professorships are saying, you should be trying this, you should be doing this, you can come in with this. And they're like, nah, just, I want to write my 800 words, thank you. So I think there's this assumption that everyone who comes in a newsroom in their 20s will have 400,000 TikTok followers and want to turn every story into dance. And if they do, brilliant. But a lot of them don't. So I think you actually do have to do the work of convincing sort of journalists right across the experience and the age spectrum. And I do think that means you have to know why you're doing it and what it's for and how it joins in, and have good breaks on the toxicity of it and ways that people can sort of interact with audiences in more controlled ways if, they're not willing to or put themselves out in, the often shark pit that is Twitter.
I think our time is almost up, unless anybody... yes, your last question. Yeah.
So how do you identify what is true expertise and what is instrumentalizing a certain point of view?
So that was a perfectly valid challenge about my little anecdote about tax experts, and the question is how do we know that the people who then pop up can be trusted? And I suppose one answer to that is we were at such a basic level of knowledge that actually having anybody who come in and say, well, this is what this document is saying, was useful. But I think what would have happened in that case is that we would have then checked out the bona fides of the people who were there, and you would then do the journalistic work to check that this person actually was who they say that they were and didn't have any hidden agenda, and so on and so forth. It was mostly, so it's not that you abandon all your journalistic instincts, but you have this huge pool of help, which I think we've heard this morning, that is there and willing to help and be part of it, if only you would let them in. I think we should stop, and we should, this has been a fabulous panel. You've admitted there are no skeptics in the room at the end of this, so I think we've been wholly convincing, and I think you'll need to go off and get a cup of coffee, but thank you for coming.